The appointment of Benjamin Franklin. Origins of the system. 1775. The summer of 1775 in Philadelphia was not merely a season, it was a physical weight. The air, thick with the humidity rising from the Delaware River, settled heavily upon the brick facades of the city, pressing against the glass panes of the Pennsylvania State House. Inside the assembly room, where the blinds were drawn against the harshness of the July sun, the atmosphere was composed of dust, the scratch of quill pens, and the quiet, anxious murmurs of men who were in the process of dismantling an empire. To understand the origins of the United States Postal Service, one must first understand the silence of that room. It was a silence filled with the need for connection. In a world without telegraphs, without telephones, and certainly without the digital networks that would weave the future together, the only thread binding the 13 disparate colonies together was the handwritten letter, a piece of parchment, folded, sealed with wax, and carried by hand across the muddy, rutted tracks that passed for roads in the 18th century. On July 26, 1775, the Second Continental Congress turned its attention away from the looming specter of war and toward the practical necessity of logistics. They were not discussing gunpowder on this afternoon. They were discussing paper. They were not discussing the movement of armies, but the movement of information. It was on this humid Wednesday that the Congress resolved to establish a dedicated line of communication, a United States Post Office, and to appoint a man to lead it who understood the intricate, boring, and vital machinery of the mail better than anyone else in the Western Hemisphere. That man was Benjamin Franklin. At 69 years old, Franklin was the oldest delegate in the room. He sat with the heaviness of his years, his spectacles perched upon his nose, listening as the committee read the resolution. He was not a soldier. He was a printer. He was a man of ink and type, a man who believed that the flow of commerce and the flow of ideas were the twin heartbeats of a civilized society. The younger men in the room, Jefferson, Adams, and Hancock, they spoke of liberty in abstract, soaring terms. Franklin, however, understood that liberty required infrastructure. The resolution passed that day was simple in its wording, but monumental in its implication. It read, that a Postmaster General be appointed for the United Colonies, who shall hold his office at Philadelphia and shall be allowed a salary of $1,000 per annum for himself and $340 per annum for a secretary and comptroller. With the strike of a gavel, the system was born. But to truly appreciate this moment, we must look back at what existed before the gavel fell. We must look at the chaotic, disorganized world of colonial communication that Franklin was tasked with taming. Before 1775, the mail was a creature of the British Crown. It was known as the parliamentary post. For decades, the transmission of letters was not a right of the people, but a privilege of the empire, designed primarily to serve the needs of the king and his governors. It was a system rife with suspicion. In the years leading up to the Revolution, the Royal Mail system had become a tool of surveillance. A letter sent through the official channels was liable to be opened, read by British loyalists, and resealed before it ever reached its destination. The privacy of correspondence was a myth. Merchants in Boston, lawyers in New York, and planters in Virginia had grown weary of this intrusion. They had begun to bypass the Royal Mail entirely, trusting their letters to private travelers, sea captains, or the constitutional post established by the printer William Goddard just a year prior. This underground network relied on trust and the quiet defiance of the colonists. Letters were left at coffee houses and taverns, tucked into leather satchels and carried by riders who swore allegiance not to the king, but to the concept of privacy. Benjamin Franklin knew this landscape intimately. He had, ironically, spent decades serving as the joint Postmaster General for the Crown in North America. From 1753 to 1774, he had ridden the post roads himself. He had visited the small, dusty offices in rural hamlets. He had measured the distances between milestones with a custom-made odometer attached to his carriage wheel. He had reorganized the schedules, demanding that riders travel through the night, cutting the delivery time between Philadelphia and Boston down from 6 weeks to just 6 days. He had built the very machine that the British were now using against the colonies, and now, in July of 1775, the Continental Congress was asking him to build a new machine, one that belonged to the people. As Franklin accepted the appointment, he did not merely accept a title, he accepted a logistical puzzle of immense proportions. Imagine, for a moment, the physical reality of the American colonies in 1775. There were no highways. The post road that connected the colonies was often little more than a cleared path through the dense ancient forests of the eastern seaboard. In the north, the roads were rocky and prone to freezing. In the south, they were sandy and often swallowed by swamps during the rainy season. The system Franklin envisioned was a single continuous chain of communication stretching from Falmouth, Maine, then part of Massachusetts, all the way down to Savannah, Georgia. This was the main line. It was the spine of the nation. From this spine, smaller cross-posts would branch out, reaching inland to the smaller settlements that dotted the frontier. The work began in a small office in Philadelphia. It was a quiet work. It involved the acquisition of ledgers, heavy leather-bound books where every letter sent and every penny collected would be recorded. The tools of the trade were humble: quill pens made from goose feathers, sharp knives to trim the nibs, pots of iron gall ink that turned purple to a permanent black as it dried, and distinct metal stamps used to mark the city of origin. Franklin's philosophy was of efficiency and standardization. Under the old system, the cost of sending a letter was a complicated affair, calculated based on the number of sheets of paper and the distance traveled. A single sheet sent up to 60 miles might cost 6 pence. If the distance was between 60 and 100 miles, the price rose to 8 pence. Franklin had to simplify this, ensuring that the rates were uniform enough to be understood by the common citizen, yet high enough to pay for the horses, the feed, and the riders. Let us visualize the process of sending a letter in this newborn system. A citizen in Philadelphia, perhaps a merchant wishing to order goods from a supplier in New York, would sit at his desk. The room would be lit by tallow candles. He would take a sheet of paper. Paper was expensive, handmade from linen rags, thick and textured. He would write his message, careful not to waste space, writing all the way to the edges. He would not use an envelope, for envelopes were a waste of paper and would double the postage cost. Instead, he would fold the paper intricately, tucking the edges into one another to form a small rectangular packet. He would then heat a stick of sealing wax over a candle flame. The wax, which was usually red, would drip on the seam of the folded paper, and while the wax was still hot and viscous, he would press his personal seal, a ring or a metal stamp, into the blob, leaving a unique impression. This seal was the only guarantee of security. If the wax was cracked, the recipient would know the letter had been read. The merchant would then walk to the local post office, often located in a corner of a print shop or a tavern. A postmaster, appointed by Franklin's network, would weigh the letter in a small brass balance. He would check the distance to New York in his rate book. He would then take up his hand stamp, dip it in ink, and mark the letter. In 1775, stamps were not adhesive labels. They were ink marks applied directly to the letter, indicating that postage was due. Unlike today, the postage was usually paid by the person receiving the letter, not the sender. This ensured that the mail was actually delivered. The postwriter only got paid if the letter reached its destination and the recipient paid the fee. Once the letter was accepted, it entered the rhythm of the road. This is the part of the history that is most hypnotic, the sheer, repetitive endurance of the postwriters. Franklin understood that the reliability of the mail depended entirely on these writers. They were the blood cells of the system. A postwriter in 1775 was a solitary figure. He traveled alone, often armed with a pistol to ward off highwaymen or wild animals, though attacks were surprisingly rare. The mail was carried in a portmanteau, a large leather bag strapped behind the saddle. These bags were waterproofed with oil and tar to protect the fragile paper inside from the summer thunderstorms and winter snows. The rider did not travel the entire distance from Maine to Georgia. The system was a relay.
A rider might cover 30 to 50 miles a day depending on the weather and the condition of the road. He would arrive at a stage, usually an inn or a stable designated as a post stop. There, the leather bag would be unlocked, the local mail would be taken out, and new mail heading further down the line would be put in. The bag would be locked again, strapped onto a fresh horse, and a fresh rider would continue the journey. Clip-clop, clip-clop. The sound of hooves on packed earth was the metronome of the colonies. Franklin's genius lay in his attention
to the dead letters. He established the position of a surveyor of the post, a role he had once held himself. The surveyor's job was to travel the roads constantly, inspecting the riders and the postmasters. Were the riders staying on schedule? Were the horses well fed? Was the mail being left unattended at taverns? Franklin knew that a delay of even one day could ruin a merchant or leave a general without orders. He insisted on night riding for the most important routes, a dangerous and exhausting practice that required riders to navigate pitch-black forests by the light of the moon or the dim glow of a lantern. In the first few months of his tenure, Franklin spent his days in the small office in Philadelphia, surrounded by maps. He was mapping a nation that did not yet technically exist. The Declaration of Independence was still a year away. The colonies were still technically British, yet they were operating a sovereign communication network. Every letter sent through Franklin's post was a small act of treason, a quiet assertion of independence. He wrote letters to his deputies, instructing them on the finer points of accounting. He demanded that ledgers be sent to Philadelphia every quarter for audit. He established a dead letter office for mail that could not be delivered, ensuring that valuable documents or money enclosed in letters could eventually be returned to the sender. This attention to the lost items created a sense of trust in the system. The public began to believe that if they put a letter in the post, it would not disappear into the void. The financial model of the Postal Service in 1775 was precarious. Congress had no money to subsidize it. The system had to be self-sustaining. The postage fees collected had to cover the wages of the postmasters and the contracts with the riders. Franklin, ever the pragmatist, set the rates carefully. He knew that if he made postage too expensive, people would simply go back to sending letters via private travelers. If he made it too cheap, the system would go bankrupt. He walked this tightrope with the calculation of a scientist. It is interesting to note the physical environment of the post office itself during this era. It was not the sterile, fluorescent-lit building we know today. A post office in 1775 was a hub of social life. It smelled of tobacco smoke, damp wool, and newsprint. Because newspapers were carried by the post riders, often for a very low fee, another one of Franklin's innovations to spread information, the post office was where people gathered to hear the news of the world. When the post rider arrived, blowing a small brass horn to announce his approach, the tavern or shop would fall silent. The bag would be opened. The names on the letters would be read aloud. A letter for Mr. Smith, a letter for Widow Jenkins. If the recipient was not there, the letter would be placed in a wooden rack with glass panes, visible to all who entered until it was claimed. This public nature of the mail bound the community together. To receive a letter was an event. It was a physical connection to the outside world. Franklin's tenure as the first Postmaster General of the United Colonies would technically last only about a year, until late 1776, when he was sent to France to secure support for the revolution. But in that short year, he laid a foundation that was so solid, so geometrically sound, that the structure would support the weight of a growing nation for centuries to come. He established the roots, he established the accounting, but most importantly, he established the ethos. Franklin believed that the post office was not merely a service, it was a right. He believed that the ability of a citizen in the rural backwoods of Pennsylvania to communicate with a delegate in Philadelphia was essential to the concept of a republic. If the people were to govern themselves, they had to know what was happening. They had to be able to speak to one another across the vast distances. As the summer of 1775 turned into autumn, the leaves on the trees lining the post roads turned from green to gold and crimson. The air grew crisp, the roads hardened with the coming frost, and along these roads the riders continued, day and night, through rain and snow. The ledger books in Philadelphia began to fill up, entries of postage paid and postage due. lists of riders hired and horses purchased. These boring, mundane lists were the evidence of a system coming to life. One can imagine Franklin, late at night, sitting by the hearth in his Philadelphia home. The city is asleep. The only sound is the crackling of the fire. He holds a map in his hands, tracing the line from Falmouth to Savannah with his finger. He knows that at this very moment, somewhere deep in the woods of Virginia, a lone rider is guiding his horse along a dark path, carrying a leather bag filled with the thoughts, fears, and hopes of a people on the brink of war. The system was working. The appointment was fulfilled. The Continental Congress had asked for a way to connect the colonies. Franklin gave them a nervous system. He gave them the ability to transmit a signal from the brain of the Congress to the limbs of the militia. This was the beginning. The horses were slow, the roads were treacherous, and the future was uncertain, but the mail was moving, and once it started moving, it would never stop. Through wars, through depressions, through plagues and technological revolutions, the mechanism that Benjamin Franklin wound up in July of 1775 would continue to tick, a steady, rhythmic pulse underlying the entire history of the United States. As we close the ledger on 1775, we leave the post riders to their long, lonely journeys. The sun sets over the 13 colonies. The candles are extinguished in the post offices, but the road remains. And on the road, the faint echo of hoofbeats promises that the message will arrive.